wages up in other parts of the world. I think part of the reason we're seeing so many tensions is because of the wage differentials in so many countries around the world. And I think that that as some of the lower wage countries are able to start paying more and those start to converge, I think that may ease some of the tensions over goods being produced in other countries. But I think re-regionalization is a good thing. And, you know, I think it's good culturally, it's good climate-wise, and I think it's something that should be pursued.
Okay. So yeah, I think you've talked quite a bit about, you know, how the diversification of supply chain is very important in a globalization stage. We actually see many of our clients, you know, globalizing and diversifying their supply chain, not just for the label on the product, but really to move the production, you know, on the diversified basis. And one of the view that I hold is that globalizing is never purely a business decision. It actually has very much personal effects behind it. You know, spending a week in some place versus spending months in some places actually have, you know, personal effects on you. So one of the things I wanted to kind of curious about is obviously we know that, you know, America is a great country because of the immigration culture. And I know you have studied the immigration policy since COVID or since 2008, you mentioned?
Since very early in my career. I mean, my mother was an immigrant from Belgium. She was very small, 3 years old.
Okay.
But I was very, very interested in immigration. I went to high school in Texas, where immigration was a very big thing. I moved to New York City, where I wrote a lot about Dominican and Haitian immigrants. And then later, after 9/11, I looked at the impact of the virtual shutdown of immigration after 9/11, because all the new regulations and processes pretty much ground things to a halt. And so I wrote about the economic impact of that in my second book, Lockout. And it was amazing to see that it was, you know, in soccer, someone might call it an own goal. I mean, the United States was really hurting itself. It was hurting U.S. businesses. It was losing out on global talent. I interviewed a couple of Chinese students, graduate students, who had gone back to China for holidays and had trouble getting back in to the United States, and you know, lost their apartment, lost grants for very, very important research.
So that was back in 2000?
There's early 2000s, yeah. And so I think that, you know, the subtitle was, you know, why America keeps getting immigration wrong when our prosperity depends on getting it right. And I see some of the rhetoric in Washington right now that's making the same mistakes that were made after 9/11. And this is the time when the global economy is slowing, and cutting back on immigration, this is threat of deportations, is going to be one more thing that's going to add to inflation and is going to slow the global economy. And again, I really, really hope that I am wrong on this, and I hope that that's not the direction that things are going to go, but that's where the rhetoric is pointing at this point.
But we all know that Mr. Trump is a businessman. Do you believe that in terms of immigration based on investment schemes will still thrive, or you think he's going to reconsider the entire immigration policy?
Well, he plays a good businessman on TV.
Okay. Yes, we all know that.
I think, you know, I think that there are definitely some people who have his ear, who think that the EB-5 visas and H-1B visas and those things should be continued and perhaps improved in some ways. That's one of those things where we just don't know what's going to happen. There's a big rift in the Republican Party, actually, about some of these skilled worker visas. So that's, I think, something that's going to be fought out in Congress and with the influence or not of business sectors. Of course, Silicon Valley has contributed quite a bit to the campaign, to the inauguration. So I think that they've got his ear.
Okay.
So again, I'm hoping I'm wrong.
Okay.
I don't often want to be wrong, but
Let's hope so. We all hope so. And also, sort of switching gears, obviously, immigration policy has a lot of impact on labor force. But switching gears, I'm recently rereading the classic anti-utopia book called Brave New World. You must have heard of that book. And it really depicted the picture of the future world when technology is at a very, very developed stage, which reminded me how, especially with the super technology, AI, quantum computing, it's evolving so fast. Do you believe that, or could you share a little insights how corporations and firms should prepare for a day where you probably don't take into human labor force so much elements into your production or profit margin?
Yeah, well, I remember being in high school reading all of that dystopian literature, the Orwell and Aldous Huxley and all of that. I hear lots.
Kind of scary, huh?
It is scary. Although in the times that I've been working with AI, figuring out how to incorporate it into my work, luckily a lot of the thinking, the analysis, the strategy that I do, it's nowhere close to to where it needs to be. And even doing images for my presentation, sometimes I just have to throw up my hands and come up with a completely different prompt. We've got a long way to go. We still have these hallucinations, AI making things up. But there are areas where it is very helpful. Translation, sorting through lots and lots of data, and of course that's such a big part of the economy these days.
Sure.
And so there are things that it can do well that can really enhance human productivity. I think that in some cases it's being misused. I hear that lots and lots of scientific journals are all of a sudden starting to have bits of AI in them, and it's not good. One of them accidentally had AI as a co-author. So I think that there's a big learning curve. Right now, a lot of companies are saying, now with AI.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
It's like a buzzword, all natural, plant-based, make up some marketing slogan.
Yeah.
They don't
it
even
does
know.
sound very TV
There's a lot of dumb money out there just being thrown at AI for the sake of being thrown at AI so that you can say that you're throwing money at AI. And I think that we're starting to see some changes. I mean, like some move away from these large language models to small language models, to things where you control the set of inputs, where you can be much more specific, where you can have some reliability of the sources, things like that. I think companies are worried about information that gets uploaded into some robot brain somewhere. And there are privacy issues, there are all sorts of things, and I think that there's a lot of sorting out that needs to be done there. And I think there's also a lot of concern about model collapse, is when AI is reading AI, it's like a TV screen with a TV inside a TV inside a TV, and it collapses on itself. And I think there are worries about that. So I think that a bit of a pause, 10 deep breaths about AI would be very, very useful. I've heard a lot of comparisons to the tech bubble in the late 90s to 2000, where people were throwing money at all sorts of things, and it collapsed. And we see a lot of situations where investors have been trying to blitzscale things, and then once they don't have the cheap money anymore, it falls apart. I mean, ride shares are seeing some of this problem, and So I think that when you have a slowing economy, that's when all of the
Technology.
Yeah, it's what I mean. I think it's where the things that are going wrong start coming up. You know, the water level falls, and you see what's underneath there, and it's a time for reflection, for creative destruction, for recognizing the gray rhinos that you should let trample things, because every once in a while letting things get trampled is the right solution.
Okay. Good. So let's hope that, hopefully the AI technology will stay useful, but probably not fundamentally collapsing or replacing.
I think it's this humans having the skills to use AI appropriately, as opposed to not. You know, I teach students, and really wrestled. A lot of educators have.
Do you allow them to use AI to write papers?
Not to write the papers, but for translation, for data analysis, for editing. And some of them I beg to use editing software.
Of course.
Beg them to use. But you know, you can kind of tell, you get a sort of a spidey sense for when someone's trying to use it to write something. It's kind of a bunch of vague generalizations that aren't really saying anything at all. And I tell them, I said, look, this writes like a C- grade high school sophomore, and you're going to get a grade like that if you use it. So I think it's recognizing. But you know, there's a couple students who used AI to sort out some data and come up with some really interesting conclusions, and that is fantastic. And I have a lot of students from countries all around the world. Some of them, English is not their first language, and I'm happy that they can use it to translate, to edit, to become more confident about that.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, great. So let's spend a little time on investing. That's our main theme. We actually, help our clients. Been helping them for 23 years since we're founded. So we're trying to work with our clients in terms of how to allocate their wealth based on their risk appetite, their future life plans. But one of the biggest tools is obviously investing. And many of our clients actually are very sophisticated investors themselves. Do you have any advice in terms of, based on your gray rhino theory, when people are making investment decisions, what are some of the typical errors that they might make in terms of assessing the risk?
I think one of the errors that people make is not being aware of what they bring to their risk choices.
Okay.
We make 35,000 choices a day, and every one of those choices is a risk, and every risk is a choice. But people really don't spend enough time thinking about, how come I won't jaywalk, but my friend will? How come, my cousin heard this stock tip from his mechanic and went and put half his life savings in it, and people have very, very different processes for making decisions. So one is be aware of your own relationship with risk. Understand what your innate personality brings to it. Think about your experiences. I mean, did you lose a lot of money on something? Did you make a lot of money on a slot machine? What are the good and bad experiences that have shaped your impressions about what future experiences might be? And then what are your processes and habits? How much homework do you do? How familiar are you with whatever it is that you're investing in? Can you really explain what that product is? Have you talked to people who you believe know what they're doing? I mean, have you created the process and really created the support system around you to make those decisions? Are you methodical about it? And then once you understand those inputs, you can optimize them. And so when you're analyzing where you're going to invest, you've you've got a framework for it.
Sure. It's almost like the classic war theory book, 孙子兵法, right? The war theory is that you have to know your enemy and you have to know yourself.
Yes, and the knowing yourself is it's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, you know.
It's true. Okay, so I think in your new book, you mentioned about how people should be aware of what they bring to table themselves. In your new book, you actually talked about probably a group of people, how culture and psychological patterns may affect people about risk taking. So I have an interesting question that what do you have? Do you have any observation of Asian culture background when this group of entrepreneurs, when they invest, when they expand their operations, do you see some typical patterns in terms of decision making or dealing with the risks?
There are some patterns, but with the caveat that I don't want to create stereotypes out of different patterns. I think you need to look at everyone on their own because there's always someone who's got some.
I can probably contribute one very minor thing, which is very interesting actually. For China entrepreneurs, we're so used to instant responses on WeChat, right? So I don't know if you use WeChat.
I do.
So it's not like email. So when you send a message, you expect immediate response. So when entrepreneurs actually go outside of China, they're back to the world of emails. So they're not very used to that. They're like, how come you don't ignoring me? They still replied within the same business day. So the speed of how things are happening and how things are handled, I think that's one of the things that I think I'm seeing very interesting culture differences. So maybe from risk taking, do you believe that they'll play a part in this risk taking?
Well, I think there's like what I call a risk muscle. Is that if you're used to making decisions quickly, then you're more comfortable doing that. And if you're used to having lots of time to make a decision, then you might do that, or you might be the kind of person who realizes, oh, I've done this 10 times before. I don't need to go through the whole process in my head. I can make a decision right away based on the risk muscle that I've developed. One of the things that really surprised me, of course, was when the gray rhino came out in China, and people immediately understood what I was talking about. And I got a lot of pushback in the United States.
Oh, really?
It was funny. Like, editors at first said, well, if something's obvious, we're paying attention to it. So why do we need a book? It's not counterintuitive. I said, oh, it's so counterintuitive. You don't even know it's counterintuitive. And, we really got this pushback. And it came to Asia, and people said, you gave us a way to talk about what was already on our minds.
Sure.
And I've looked at a lot of ways, a lot of cultural theories about Asians versus the West, systems thinking versus linear. And I thought, how did I get an Asian brain? My family's from Austrian and Belgian immigrants, way back. I started my career in Latin America and Europe, but I think that there is a more thoughtful approach to some of these risks. And I think that there's a familiarity with change. Every time I come back to Asia, I see so many new things, the architecture, the infrastructure, the ideas, the technology, and it blows me away. So I think some of it's a familiarity with change. Some of it is a willingness to talk about some of the difficult subjects, which is a complete contradiction of what the Western stereotype is of Asians, which is really interesting. I would really like to see more exchange and people becoming more familiar with each other. But I found that lots of different cultures have their own approach to the processes, how fast they do something, how slowly they do something, the kind of people they're comfortable with, the kind of risk that they'll take that certain financial risks are okay, but other ones aren't. Certain ethical risks are okay, and some of them aren't. Sure. And we saw this actually, during COVID, a huge, wide variety of responses as the virus made its way around the world.
Yeah.
And different policy responses,
Masks, no masks.
Masks, no masks, different people in the population.
Sure.
And it was just absolutely fascinating to me to see how different countries really, first how fast they recognized the problem, how quickly they did something about it, how much pushback they got from their citizens, and then as the vaccines came, how many people took vaccines, and I think it goes down to these cultural factors, things that people don't even think about that affect the risks that they take.
Sure. I think you always kind of lean on your culture and risk muscle when it comes down to, especially if you need very quick response into it. For example, my previous life is an auditor. So when I look at investment opportunities, I always look at downside first, right? It's real companies, it's real business. But for some of the VC people, obviously, all they are looking at is the room of growth. So that's very interesting as well. So last question, we actually help our clients in terms of wealth allocation. One of the very important aspects is heritage of their wealth. And we're seeing a very clear trend of generational transition. So from entrepreneur generation 1 to the second generation. So I think one of the things about the longevity of the family's wealth is how do you handle risks? Do you have any advice if you're running a brand new family office when you're writing the risk chapter? How would you outline that chapter?
Well, I would say that different generations should have an open conversation about risk. Every generation is a product of their times. So they are going to look at different risks in other ways. And every generation, depending on where they are at their time of life, they've got different priorities, which means there are different risks that they're willing to take or not. When I was writing You Are What You Risk, Gray Rhino 2, I spoke with a friend who had recently become CEO of his family's conglomerate in a Central American country. And during the civil wars in the 80s, early 90s, they'd lost 75% of their assets, all nationalized. And so that generation was all about preservation of capital.
Sure.
And the newer generation could see how things were changing, and they didn't want to be left behind. They wanted to grow in new ways with new things. Mm-hmm. And so there was a real clash there. And so part of the conversation they needed to have with the older generation was, well, why do you want to preserve capital? And it's like, well, to pass it on to the new generation.
Sure.
Well, then maybe paying attention to the new generation's risk priorities is important.
Sure.
And I think that once you have an open conversation about attitudes towards risk, about relationships with risk, you can come up with a diversified approach that meets different people's needs. And of course, diversification is a great investment strategy anyway.
Yeah.
In fact, not just a great investment, it's just what you should do it.
One of the few free lunches.
Exactly. But I think you're speaking openly about, okay, why are you putting all of your money in CDs?
Sure.
Or why are you putting all of your money into some speculative new technology that nobody even knows works?
Yeah.
And see if you can come up with a mix that works for generations. And I think a lot of people in newer generations are also much more interested in impact investing, in social enterprises, in making something, producing something that creates something good in the world, that solves a problem somewhere. Sure. And I hear about that in the newest generations, taking jobs in whatever they do. And so I think that that's something that older generations should recognize, because they're passing they're passing their wealth on to a future generation, and that's their way of contributing, of doing something good. So I think paying attention to people who do want to do social enterprise and impact investing, to basically, to provide the clean technologies that will help us to solve climate change, to provide access to education, to finance, to things like that. It's, to healthcare, all sorts of ways that people can, do well by doing good, as the cliche goes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, last thing, another question. I know most authors write books and read books. If you'd like to recommend 3 great books to our clients, to our friends, what would be the titles of the 3 books?
3 great books. Oh, that's a tough one. Because I'm really bad at picking favorites.
Sure.
I'm horrible at it. But I actually want to go back to something that a close friend of my father's, Bernard Rappaport, an insurance entrepreneur in Waco, Texas, said to me when I was in high school, and I was interested in reading all sorts of nonfiction, serious stuff. And he said, read more fiction.
Read more fiction.
Read more fiction. Yeah. And it's interesting. I've spoken with people about how some governments have actually turned to speculative fiction writers to think about how the future might unfold, and I think that's actually a really good idea for investors and for entrepreneurs, in particular.
Okay.
There's some interesting climate fiction out there, and there's some dystopian fiction out there.
Of course.
So I would say, fiction. Find some authors. I mean, I've been trying to read a lot of Asian authors, particularly since I started to travel here, and So
read more fiction. Read more about other different cultures.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Michele, and I've had a great time.
Thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you so much.